I'm going to tell you a bit about the larger context that gave rise to the research that'll be the mainstay of this talk. There's an informal network of people called the Council on Spiritual Practices that I convened in about 1994, and they are experts in some of the behavioral sciences and in religious studies and in history. It's really a circle of elders that gathered to ask the question, given what they know about psychoactive substances and the hallucinogen family, what could we do that would actually bring about a better world? So the vision was really about reducing avoidable suffering, happier people, joy, a happier world, and I guess my tip of the hat to the futurists in the room will be to say evolution, whatever that means. So if that means dramatic transformation of society or transhuman thinking, well, let's just put that under the category of evolution and say, we don't want that to stop. A reason for having this point here is to say that not everyone really shares that vision. There are people whose chosen focus and set of gifts is around art or around increasing scientific knowledge, primarily. And this is a little bit more of an engineering effort. This is actually about bringing about change in the world that isn't just about knowledge or just about art, but could include those things. Well, if you start with a vision of wanting to have a happier, better world with less avoidable suffering, that's a pretty lofty vision. And the question is, what do you do when you get up the next morning to bring that about? Or next week or next month? What's an actionable agenda? And this group, because of some shared knowledge or belief in the power of entheogens, said, well, we have a point of entry here. And the point of entry has to do with these strong, powerful, profound experiences that some people have, sometimes with substances, sometimes without. They're recorded throughout all the ages and all cultures. And they go by a bunch of different names, but there's a set of experiences that people report having, which after they've had them, they say, wow, that changed my life. And things begin unfolding differently, understandings begin unfolding differently. When it goes well, which it does not always, but when it goes well, people say, I think I'm probably a kinder person, probably a more generous person. And we'd like for there to be more of that in the world. So that's our point of entry. What about these occasional, profound, potentially life-changing, potentially world-changing experiences? CSP thought that a way of bringing more attention to this would be through science. And there's a reason for that. In our modern culture, we've come to trust science. When I say we, I don't mean everyone in the room, I mean the culture as a whole. Modernity tends to trust science. In fact, it trusts science as maybe the ultimate oracle of truth. So if we could bring to bear high-quality science coming from an institution of very high regard, that might bring attention not only to the substances, but arguably more importantly to those occasional life-changing experiences. And it would be important, again, to have this come from an institution of high regard and for the science itself to be the highest quality that we can muster, simply so that it will withstand scientific scrutiny. Well, that led us in time to a man at the Johns Hopkins University named Roland Griffiths, a career psychopharmacologist, who some years before that had actually taken up a personal practice of meditation, a disciplined practice of meditation. So with his career in experimental psychopharmacology on the one hand and personal interest in meditation, it was a pretty natural progression for him to say, wow, there's this other category of drugs that he had not studied before, the hallucinogens, which could bring about in a laboratory setting maybe some experiences that were related to what he was having in meditation, ashrams, and on the cushion. It's understood generally that science lags practice. So we know that the measures that scientists have, the kinds of things that we can look at in a controlled experimental environment are pretty crude compared to what advanced practitioners and teachers have in their minds and hearts, but that's the best we've got. I just want to acknowledge that the kinds of results we'll talk about in a little bit, that's a pretty small piece of the experiential pie of what can happen with entheogens. So we eventually mounted a study involving psilocybin, which is one of the principal psychoactive components of a genus of mushrooms, the name of which may be changing. Thank you for elucidating that for us. There are other chemicals that may be psychoactive in the mushrooms. Psilocin is actually in the human being the active species. Psilocybin is converted in the body to psilocin. There are others as well, but psilocybin is the stable chemical that you can isolate from the mushrooms or synthesize from scratch, and is therefore convenient when you want to do a controlled scientific study. It's considered to be a classical hallucinogen. I won't go through all these points, but psychopharmacologists say classical hallucinogen to distinguish it from MDMA and ketamine and cannabis and other substances that may be considered to be entheogenic or psychedelic. These points are here. This is how we would speak to a scientifically inclined audience trained in the science of psychopharmacology of abusable drugs. We know that hallucinogens are scheduled in the most restricted class in the United States because they're considered to have high abuse potential. But what does that mean exactly? The National Institute on Drug Abuse in America considers the hallucinogens drugs of abuse but not drugs of addiction because they're not typically reinforcing. They don't reliably produce euphoria. So if you give them to laboratory animals, the animals will not choose to take more of the drug, as they typically would with cocaine, for example. We know that medical emergencies are quite rare. LSD and psilocybin are mentioned in only a teensy fraction of drug-related emergency department admissions. And despite the fact that there's a low risk of actual physical addiction, and in the case of psilocybin, no known organic toxicity, for example, to the liver or to the brain, there's still concern about abuse because of potential adverse psychiatric effects. That could even include something like panicked behaviors, which if you're an epidemiologist, that counts as toxic. How about human research with psilocybin? When psilocybin was first isolated from psilocybin mushrooms by Albert Hofmann, there began some study of psilocybin, and it wasn't very long before that research mostly stopped. It got caught up in the illegalization of psilocybin and the other hallucinogens as a consequence, really, of the drug excesses of the 1960s. Most of those early studies were done at a time when the science of pharmacology was younger, and most of the studies that were done with psilocybin did not involve what's called a control group or a comparison group. In other words, they were kind of like clinical case reports, published reports of what happens when a researcher takes them, him or herself, or a psychiatrist gives them to a patient. So decades later, in 2006, we undertook a study of psilocybin in order to determine the feasibility, again, to modern standards, of giving a high dose of psilocybin to healthy volunteers. Let me take a minute to explain why the emphasis on healthy volunteers. Much of the research that's now taking place with hallucinogens is studying giving them to people who have psychiatric conditions. It could be something like anxiety or depression secondary to a cancer diagnosis, or post-traumatic stress disorder. There's now studies taking place of hallucinogens and related compounds as a treatment for cluster headaches. And obviously, all of those studies are working with patient populations, people that are, by current Western medical standards, subnormal. And we wanted to cast the spotlight on what happens when people who, by current Western standards, are at normal or above normal. And there are a lot of reasons for it. One is that probably accounts for most use of psilocybin. Most of the current illicit use of psilocybin is not done by people who have psychiatric issues at clinical levels. And it would also cast light on, maybe revisiting at some point the legal status of psilocybin. Another objective of the study, again, was to use current psychopharmacology methods. And that means a double-blind, in our case, triple-blind controlled experiment. Well, that's kind of hard to do with psilocybin. If you're testing something like an antibiotic, you can give people capsules. One has the old antibiotic and another has the placebo, or one has the old antibiotic and one has a new test antibiotic, and you can compare them. And typically when you swallow an antibiotic, you don't really know what you got, right? It's not psychoactive. But in the case of a hallucinogen, they have a profile of effects which are different from other psychoactive drugs. So it's kind of hard to do double-blind studies. One way we thought that we would be able to do a double-blind study was to work with people who had not taken a hallucinogen before. They may have read something about it, but at least they won't have a personal experiential point of reference So hopefully we can kind of fool them into not knowing whether they got a hallucinogen or not, or a low dose or a high dose. And the last objective is simply to look at the acute and the persisting mood and psychological effects of psilocybin relative to a comparison compound that is not a hallucinogen, and in particular to design a study sensitive to the reported effects, and that would include spiritual effects. We know that psilocybin has been used for very likely thousands of years in various cultures, specifically for religious, divinatory, healing, spiritual purposes. So the design of the study involved 36 volunteers, about half male. We recruited them locally in the Baltimore, Washington area through flyers announcing a study of states of consciousness brought about by a naturally occurring psychoactive substance used sacramentally in some cultures. So right there in the recruiting flyer, we're telling people, hey, this was used sacramentally. We're now mounting a study of that at Hopkins. We wanted people who were healthy, medically and psychiatrically. And in particular, we looked at their psychiatric histories to make sure that they would not be overly likely to suffer adverse consequences in the study. The volunteers were also unpaid. In a lot of human subject research, it's common to pay volunteers for participation. We didn't do that. Why would they then give up so much time? And this is a time-intensive study. Why? Because they would be curious about the effects of psilocybin. And they would come to learn that in the course of the study, they'd be working with some interesting people and have opportunities for self-reflection. The participants that we did actually find had a median age of 46 years with a pretty broad range, highly educated, almost everyone being a college graduate and over half having postgraduate degrees. Most of the volunteers are employed full-time, some employed only part-time. And we wanted to recruit people who reported some religious or spiritual orientation. That does not necessarily mean conventionally religious. We would happily take somebody into the study if they said, for example, that they had a regular yoga practice and they construed the yoga practice not only as just a body discipline, but also as something of a spiritual discipline. We would have taken somebody who reported that they participated in an informal regular meditation group, just like a neighborhood sitting group, or somebody who said that they just had a regular reading practice of reading sacred texts from any or a variety of religious traditions. So it wasn't just churchgoers, although there were churchgoers in the group as well. The study design was this. We decided that we would compare psilocybin to a non-hallucinogen called methylphenidate. The trade name for that, at least in some countries, is Ritalin, and it's widely prescribed as a stimulant for attention deficit disorder. It's given to a lot of kids. When it's given to kids, it's not actually that much of a stimulant, but you know, if you were to encounter it on the black market, it would be taken as a stimulant. And in both cases, we gave pretty high doses. The psilocybin dose corresponds to a fair number of dried grams of mushrooms, and the methylphenidate dose is enough that if you got it, you would definitely know that you had something. Let's see how I can explain the study design to you. Most of the volunteers were randomly assigned into two groups. One group, Group A, is going to get psilocybin on one session, and then 2 months later is going to get methylphenidate. Group B is going to get them in the opposite order. It's called a counterbalance design. So eventually, everybody will have one psilocybin session and one methylphenidate session. We took 6 of the volunteers and randomly assigned them into a third group that would get methylphenidate on the first 2 sessions, separated by 2 months, and then, skipping to the last point here, if somebody got methylphenidate on session 1, 2 months later, methylphenidate on session 2, 2 months after that, we would tell them, you haven't yet gotten psilocybin, we're going to give you psilocybin on a 3rd session. And the reason for that was to help keep the study and the study monitors blind to the drug conditions. If you take a minute and think about it, if you're a monitor in the room taking care of the volunteer who's having the session, and you kind of think they probably didn't get psilocybin on the first session, if we only had 2 groups and everyone got exactly 2 sessions, then you can kind of guess that the next one would probably be psilocybin. So knowing that some people were going to get 3 sessions helped keep the study, everyone involved in the study, blind to the actual conditions. So we know now that everyone either got a pretty high dose of methylphenidate or a pretty high dose of psilocybin, but the volunteers did not know that going into it, and the monitors did not know that going into it. We told them that they might in fact receive any of 11 different psychoactive substances, ranging from nicotine to caffeine, sedatives, stimulants, and they could get them in anything from a pretty low dose to a pretty high dose, or no drug at all, placebo. So we wanted to keep the expectancies as broad as possible. And even when volunteers came into the study, came into the session room, we encouraged them to not really try to not guess what they were getting and to just be with the experience and let it happen. The study design involved a whole bunch of measures. These are standardized measures, quantitative measures, some of them physiological. During the session, the monitors would occasionally measure blood pressure and heart rate. That's partly for safety reasons and partly just so we can gather more data about the effects of psilocybin. 7 hours after drug ingestion, we gave a number of standardized pencil and paper self-report tests. And also, before the first session and at intervals throughout participation in the study, we took longitudinal measures of mood and personality and a couple of scales that have been designed over the years to measure religious or spiritual experience, and in particular, mystical experience. When volunteers came into the study, in addition to all of the screening that they got for health reasons, we put them in relationship with two people, which sometimes in the study we call guides, spiritual guides, and in the literature we call monitors. And the volunteer would meet with the senior monitor for a total of 8 hours before coming into the session room to have the first drug session. And the purpose of that is just really to build rapport and trust. So when the monitor comes into the room and the volunteer comes into the room, they've seen each other before. The monitor knows the basic facts of the person's life and their primary relationships and their career and whatnot. So the volunteer, when he or she is laying back on the sofa and in the session, if something comes up, they may feel a little bit more at ease talking about it or being expressive in the session. So this is what the session room looks like. A lot of the early research with hallucinogens was done basically in hospital rooms, with bright fluorescent lights and people wearing clinical clothing and stethoscopes around and whatnot. And we wanted to build a little room on the Johns Hopkins campus that felt like a very warm, comfortable living room with nice, comfortable furniture, nice art on the walls, and a really nice stereo. And here's what it looks like when a session is running. Volunteers were encouraged, not required, but encouraged to just lay back on the sofa, put on eye shades if they're comfortable. They had a choice of listening to music either through loudspeakers or through headphones, or they could switch it up. They were free if they wanted to sit up for a little bit and ask for water or be guided to the bathroom. That could happen. But for the most part, we wanted people to just lay back and go into the experience and have an internal experience and not really talk with the monitors all that much, although they would respond if asked. On our left, we see the back of Mary Casamano, one of the guides, and Bill Richards, who is the senior guide and also one of the co-authors of the published papers out of the study. So, how about results of the study? Well, the first question that a scientist would ask is, was it a good study? Did you in fact maintain the blind? Do we have reason to think that this was a successful double-blind experiment? Well, the way we assessed that was by a questionnaire that we put in front of the monitors to see if they were fooled. So these are people who by the end of the study had sat for a lot of people and might be able to guess whether somebody got a stimulant or a sedative or nicotine or a placebo. And in fact, the monitors themselves, one of them, by the way, entheogenically experienced, the other not, the monitors themselves were confused in a fair fraction of the sessions. Another thing that happened is that some of the volunteers reported fairly profound experiences on the methylphenidate, including in a few instances, volunteers saying, wow, after the fact they learned it was methylphenidate, wow, that session was one of the more important things that happened in my life. So we know from this that just being in a supportive environment and having a meditative day in the company of guides that are taking care of you, that alone can be a profound experience. Taken together, we're pretty convinced that we did about as good a job as can be done doing double-blind controlled science with a hallucinogen. So what were the results? I'm not going to take a lot of time with these slides. This particular set of slides is the time course, and for each of the three groupings there, the top line is psilocybin and the bottom line is methylphenidate, the comparison substance. And the key thing to note here is that the shape of each curve is about the same. So the monitors could not come to guess what drug was being given because one was really short-acting and the other was really long-acting. We asked the monitors, in addition to taking the physiological measurements, also just to fill out a questionnaire periodically throughout the session about the behavior of the volunteer. In each of the little charts here, the black bar is psilocybin, the hashed one is methylphenidate, and let's see, psilocybin resulted, the first one to the left, in a good bit more physical arousal than methylphenidate. Talking with monitor, on the other hand, methylphenidate, which is basically speed, resulted in a lot more talking than psilocybin. The screen is pretty fuzzy here. The third one is restlessness and fidgetiness. People were pretty sedate on both drugs. Sleepiness or sedation, very low on both drugs, but even lower on psilocybin. Tearing or crying, there was more crying with psilocybin than methylphenidate. Anxiety or fearfulness, not too much on methylphenidate, a little bit more with psilocybin. Joy or intense happiness, big difference. Not too many people had joy or intense happiness with methylphenidate, but some did with psilocybin. And significant sense of peace or harmony, again, psilocybin significantly higher than methylphenidate. There is in the field of psychopharmacology something called the hallucinogen rating scale, which was simply designed to distinguish hallucinogens in a laboratory setting from other categories of psychoactives. And not surprisingly, a questionnaire designed to distinguish hallucinogens from other psychoactive drugs did so. You'll see the black bars are all statistically significantly higher than the hashed bars. There's a questionnaire that's been developed to evaluate mystical experience, actually more than one of them. This one is the Pankey-Richards scale, and I'll just read the categories. Unity, the sense of being connected or the sense that all is one. The next one is sacredness. Another is intuitive knowledge. In other words, the sense that, wow, I'm just getting, I can't reason it, but the experience that I'm having, I actually believe is knowledge, is true. Next is transcendence of space and time. Then deeply felt positivity. And finally, paradoxicality or ineffability. Paradoxicality is a very interesting one where you think that things that can't both be true, in this state you say, wow, there is a way that you can see them both as being true. Well, all of these markers of mystical experience, significantly higher with psilocybin, the black bar, than with methylphenidate, the hashed bar. Let's see. Somebody actually asked this question last weekend. What was the quantitative criterion for having what we call a complete mystical experience? And that was ranking more than 60%, in kind of an arbitrary scale, on all of these 6 subscales. So if all of these 6 characteristics people rated at the 60% mark or above, then we would say that they had a complete mystical experience. There's a well-validated, meaning well-used scale in the psychology of religion developed by Professor Ralph Hood called the mysticism scale. And as it's written as a pencil and paper test, it actually assesses one's like lifetime peak mystical experience. And this chart, well, keep in mind the study design involves 30 people, 30 of the 36 being randomized into one of 2 groups. Group A gets methylphenidate first, Group B gets psilocybin first. If you look at the left-hand 2 bars there, 2 months after the first session, 15 of the volunteers will have had methylphenidate but not psilocybin, and 15 of the volunteers will have had psilocybin but not methylphenidate. So the people that got psilocybin, their mysticism scale scores shot way up. The people that got methylphenidate, their scores did not go up very much. So this suggests that psilocybin is occasioning mystical experience. If you look 2 months after the second session, because this particular instrument is measuring lifetime prevalence or lifetime mystical experience and not just what happened recently, both groups are now elevated. Can you imagine newspaper headlines saying something like, scientific experiment shows mystical experience? Well, most people don't really even know what that word means. And the word mystical experience itself, that's used in the literature and the psychology of religion, but it sounds, who knows what it is really? Can you measure it? Is it significant? So what if people are having a mystical experience? We knew, some of us who've been experienced with hallucinogens, going into the study, and with the first couple of volunteers, that people were having experiences not only mystical, but we'd like to be able to express this in other language that would be meaningful to people who don't know what that means. And it really comes down to importance. How meaningful or how important was the experience? So we quickly put together a way for people to describe how important their drug experience was to them. And we just asked them, was it similar to the bottom bar here, an everyday experience, or maybe the most important thing that happens in a typical week, or the most important thing that happens in a typical month or year, or is it one of the most meaningful things that happens, say, every 5 years? Or is it among the top 10 of your life, or among the top 5 of your life, or the single most of your entire life? So we gave them a quantitative way of telling us how meaningful the experience was. Again, the black bar is psilocybin, the hash bar is methylphenidate, and you can see that the methylphenidate sessions peak at about once a month. So people are telling us, wow, that day that I spend in that nice room with those 2 nice people, that's comparable to the most important thing that happens to me in a typical month. Psilocybin, on the other hand, people tended to say, the peak there, is that was one of the 5 most important things of my entire life. And these are pretty well educated, pretty well traveled people, average age 46 years old, saying that was one of the 5 most important things of my entire life. And a significant fraction, order of a quarter to a third, said it was the single most important, personally meaningful experience of a lifetime. We asked this both with respect to the phrase personal meaning and also with respect to the phrase spiritual significance, with comparable results. If you ask about spiritual experience 2 months afterwards, that top bar there, the single most, grows even more. So a fair fraction of the volunteers in the study said that their day on psilocybin was the single most spiritually significant event of their entire lives. We did a similar kind of assessment, just asking people what impact did it have on your well-being or life satisfaction. Everyone in the study team was happy to see the bottom 3 bars. No one reported that psilocybin or methylphenidate decreased decreased well-being or life satisfaction. Nobody claimed any harm in the study, and on interview, there was no clinical evidence of harm in the study. But how about improvement? Well, again, look at the black bars, psilocybin. The single most common response is that the psilocybin experience moderately increased well-being and life satisfaction, and more than a few people said that it increased it very much. For psilocybin, the most common answer was no change. For methylphenidate, the most common answer is no change. 2 months after sessions, we looked at other ways of assessing persisting effects. Positive attitudes, a bigger response with psilocybin and methylphenidate. Positive mood changes, bigger response with psilocybin and methylphenidate. Likewise for altruistic effects, self-reported, and positive behavior changes, self-reported, all increasing more with psilocybin and less with methylphenidate. But these are self-reports, and self-reports are, you have to wonder if people are actually reporting accurately. So one thing that we did, actually, as a part of the study design, when somebody came into the study, we would ask them to give us the names of 3 adults that they would be likely to encounter over the course of the study. Could be a spouse, a neighbor, a coworker, a friend. And we asked those people, so-called community observers, if we could interview them by telephone at intervals throughout the study. So we did. We had people call up these volunteer observers and ask them to rate the volunteer on 11 dimensions. Patience, optimism, positive emotion, joy, appreciation, self-confidence. And we didn't actually have a whole lot of volunteers. 36 is not a huge number for a scientific study. So we didn't try to tease those out. We just lumped them together into a single community observer rating of each volunteer. And sure enough, the community observers tended to report that after psilocybin, people had these positive changes and really no change 2 months after methylphenidate. A significant fraction of volunteers in the study on psilocybin reported that for some fraction, or in a few unfortunate cases, like the entirety of the day, a little bit of the day, or all of the day, people had some very, very unpleasant reactions. Strong fear, strong anxiety, paranoia, what psychiatrists call ideas of reference, which is thinking, it's all about me, whether positive or negative. And The good news is it was readily managed. The monitors in the study were sitting there with people and reassuring them as necessary, and nobody tried to behave in ways that would have been harmful to them or anyone else. But it is interesting that under the conditions that we tried to create of trust and rapport and a pleasant setting and volunteers well screened and knowing what they, basically what they were signing up for, still a significant fraction had very bad experiences. And we don't really know what to do to reduce that. So the warning that comes out of all of this is, and I'm sure already well known to everyone in the room, there's a chance when somebody takes a high dose of psilocybin or a hallucinogen that they're going to have a bad experience. And particularly if it involves strong fear, anxiety, paranoia, it's not hard to imagine, and we've all heard stories of people then behaving in ways that are not very smart and could lead to harm, and in some cases has led to harm. So again, the study is confirming what's already well known amongst this community and other communities. We did a follow-up a little more than a year after the first study and administered some of the same questionnaires again. And without going into detail here, let's just say that the positive results reported at 14 or 16 months were pretty comparable to the results found at 2 months. Now, in the field of psychopharmacology, this is an amazing finding. If you give somebody a dose of a psychoactive stimulant or a sedative or whatnot, generally it's over in a day or it's over in a week. And to have a strongly persisting effect a year out is almost unheard of. But again, not a surprise to people who've had these kinds of profound experiences before. And another thing that we found when we looked at the data a little bit more closely is that the memorability of the experience, having a strong persisting effect, correlated not with intensity of the drug effect, but with whether or not somebody had a mystical experience. So if somebody had a really strong psilocybin experience, but not a mystical experience, could just be lots of colors and creative thoughts and whatnot, that would not be as memorable a year out as if somebody had these profound feelings of unity and joy and sacredness. So that seems to be the memorable, potentially life-changing point of inflection. So the study, eventually published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, concluded that yes, under these conditions of screening and preparation and supervision, it seems to be reasonably safe to give a high dose of psilocybin to healthy volunteers. And you can expect that some significant fraction of those volunteers will have unpleasant experiences. So, warning, you need a setting and supervision that will minimize any possible harm coming out of that. And under the conditions of the study, psilocybin brought about experiences which, according to our measures and being able to interview volunteers afterwards, seemed to be indistinguishable from classical mystical experiences reported in the world's religions throughout recorded history. And we need to acknowledge that the generalizability of our findings to other populations, we don't know. In particular, we don't know what would happen if we gave psilocybin to volunteers that did not report some kind of a spiritual or religious orientation to begin with. And that alone would be a nice follow-on study at some point. Well, why is this important? It's important in the field of psychopharmacology because this gives us some insight as to why it is that humans would choose to take a hallucinogen not only once, but in some cases more than once, even though it does not reliably produce euphoria. And it may eventually lead to more insights about pharmacology and brain mechanisms around hallucinogens and around this kind of mystical, cosmic consciousness type experience. I think one of the most important things that could come out of it is that we now have demonstrated that in a modern laboratory with modern techniques, we have a tool that can bring about these kinds of experiences with a much higher probability than they would occur if people were just going about ordinary life. So scientists call this the ability to prospectively bring about an experience that you want to study. And if what you'd like to study is the development of joy and happiness and generosity and forgiveness as a scientific exploration, well, it's great to be able to have an experience that will spark that developmental course that you can then spark in a laboratory. This is what the paper looked like when it appeared in the journal. And the Hopkins Media Relations Office and I had spent, a month figuring out how to explain this to the world. And in 2006, it resulted in quite a lot of press. There was coverage on a couple of the news networks on television and in most of the major newspapers, and within a week to a month in quite a few magazines also. The Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Religion News Service, India Times, with headlines such as, "Magic Mushroom Drug Study Probes Science and Spirituality." "Do mushrooms have a mystic role?" "Drugs' mystical properties confirmed." And when we did the follow-up, 14 to 16 months later, in the data analysis, we published another paper about 2 years later in 2008 that got another round of publicity. And again, these are just samplings from Pravda, Estonia, Los Angeles Times. I like the headline from the Baltimore Sun, which is where Johns Hopkins is located, Baltimore, Maryland. "Hallucinogen test is praised. Life-changing effects felt by many in study. Lead researcher excited." And the lead researcher, Roland, actually was excited. He went into this a little skeptical, that a drug could bring about an experience that often is regarded as something you get after only many years of disciplined meditation. How can a drug do this in a day? But he saw with volunteer after volunteer, people would come into his office after they'd finished in the session room looking illumined and just filled with light. And he was and still remains excited by this type of work. An acknowledgement primarily of the team. None of this could have happened without the keen scientific mind and the rigor brought to the study by Roland Griffiths. Bill Richards is a man who had done work with psilocybin and DPT and LSD back in the 60s through the mid-70s, legally, above ground, and really only stopped when funding for it dried up. We were very lucky that he ended up living in Baltimore, right where Johns Hopkins is, and could act as our experienced guide. Matt Johnson is a young scientist brought onto the team. Una McCann is a psychiatrist. Mary Casamano is a social worker who was the assistant guide, assistant monitor. Brian Richards is a PsyD, that is to say a psychologist, son of Bill Richards, so we have a little bit of lineage going here. And I get to be part of the team and have fun with these people too. These are things that didn't really fit into the main line of the presentation about the science. So I want to take off the science hat and just offer some more resources for you. The first link there, csp.org/psilocybin, has links to the 2 published papers and to the press accounts. And there may be some other links there that'll take you to other parts of the CSP website. So all that's publicly available. I've mentioned mystical experience, and I think everyone in this room probably has a good sense of what it is. But there's a page here, csp.org/PRE, that stands for Primary Religious Experience, that contains some text written by a philosopher named Walter Stace. And he's one of the first people that did a cross-cultural exploration, really, of mystical experience to try to come up with the factors that are typically, if not always, found in mystical experience. So have a look there for his description of transcendence of time and space and unitive feelings and sacredness or blessedness and so on. I'll mention here that this kind of experience goes by a whole bunch of different names. And if I forget some, please help me increase the list here. Mystical experience, cosmic consciousness, Buddha consciousness, Christ consciousness. Abraham Maslow used the term peak experience to try to take it out of the exclusive domain of spirituality and religion. What else am I missing there? Unity consciousness, non-dual consciousness. Satori, thank you. Aesthetic experience? Ascetic. Mm-hmm. Transcendental experience, yeah. Yeah, so I'm not going to claim that these are all synonyms. The traditions that each one came from may have fine nuances on it or factors that they want to have present for that word to qualify and such, but they all cluster around a set of experiences where when people have them, they'll often say, wow, that was the most important or one of the most important things that happened in my entire life. They can be a turning point in somebody's development. So Walter Stace, again, is the Westerner anyhow who came up with the first typology of what he would call mystical experience. Third bullet item here, csp.org/nomenclature. Let's see. There have been a succession of words used to describe the class of compounds that is the kind of what binds us together at this meeting. The first one in modern Western times was psychotic emetic. When these drugs were discovered, they were thought by the people who took them, not knowing much about them, that they would bring about model psychosis, and thought that they could be useful to psychiatrists because a psychiatrist could himself or herself take a psychotic emetic and have an experience comparable to what some of their patients were having. So the first word just meant, hey, this is something that makes people kind of mentally ill. The word hallucinogen was then brought into currency when it was recognized that, it's not all about mental illness. That was replaced by Humphrey Osmond's entry of the word psychedelic. And there's a woman named Lisa Biberman who was in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time of Timothy Leary and Houston Smith and the others of the Harvard Psilocybin project, who eventually wrote a couple of essays. You can actually find one of them on CSP's website, saying, the word psychedelic doesn't necessarily mean mystical, transcendental, cosmic consciousness experience anymore. The word psychedelic is coming to mean like lava lamps and certain kinds of rock music and fluorescent blacklight posters and outdoor festivals. And I think for a little while she was probably a little shocked by that and maybe even a little embittered by it, that the word psychedelic is not meaning anymore what happens when you take 300 micrograms of LSD, for example. It's more just kind of the pleasant, bright color, swirly pattern experience when you take a much lower dose or when you take it without the same kind of intention. So she proposed, let's not use the word psychedelic, except when we explicitly want to mean bell-bottom, lava lamp, and so on, the visible outward expressions of the psychedelic 60s. She proposed adopting a word that had not been adopted before, which was phanerothym. That was Aldous Huxley's entry from some years back, which obviously didn't happen. Almost no one knows the word phanerothym. But the word entheogen got coined by a small group of academics some years later, led by Jonathan Ott, who saw the same thing really that Lisa Biberman did. Hey, the word psychedelic, forget what it says in the dictionary, the way it lives in the culture, it's not meaning what we most want it to mean. So let's use this other word, entheogen. And people have written criticisms of it, saying theos is too much like the bearded white guy, but it doesn't have to mean that. What's up here at this webpage, csp.org/nomenclature, is just a collection of quotations. Some of them demonstrate how the word psychedelic is actually used in modern times, and others of them discuss mainly entheogen as a potential replacement for some of what psychedelic currently means. csp.org/CSPquotes2.pdf is another random collection of things you will probably enjoy reading. And if you read them in order, they tell a bit of a story. Another sort of odds and ends piece that didn't fit earlier in the talk. It's very common amongst people that we know to distinguish spirituality and religion. And I want to also acknowledge that some people would say, I don't believe in any of that. I'm, agnostic or atheistic, so I don't want to even go into that domain. But for those of us that can, spiritual has come to mean personal experience or beliefs validated, supported by personal experience, and we typically reserve religion for the bad stuff. That's corruption and abuse and control and propagation of palpably false mythology and whatnot. And I would like to encourage a revisiting of that. Not all religion is corrupt, and not all religion is about propagating palpably untrue mythology, and not all religious congregations and religious leaders are doing the stuff that we might judge as immature or bad or inappropriate. Some of them, in fact, are doing great work and are encouraging people to develop through their own personal experience, and they are part of organized religions. So rather than throwing out the baby with the bathwater and making what I would consider to be the diplomatic faux pas of dismissing all things religious, I would encourage people to start using language like mature religion or good religion, and to distinguish that from not so good religion or immature religion, or maybe religion that's gone off track. Okay? So let's not have the word religion necessarily mean the bad stuff. In fact, a good construal, I think a constructive construal of religion, is it's spirituality that happens in community. When we get together and talk about our experiences and kind of cross-check each other, wow, do you think this might be true? Yeah, I think it might be true, but and especially if you look at it this way. Well, those two people are engaging in the development of, a socially validated spiritual experience, and that whole enterprise, the dialogue, the conversation about it, I think it's useful, it's skillful to call that religion, or religious, or the development of religious views. Why bother with that at all? Again, I think it's good diplomacy. It's constructing a tent big enough that lots of people can participate in it, and not just the like-minded people that will come to a conference like EGA. The last grab bag item. Who here has heard of spiral dynamics, other than my mentioning it last weekend? Not many people. It is a model of stages or a developmental course of cultural thinking and mindset. And if you want to understand, for example, why for a period of time in dominant cultures and still for a lot of people in our culture, people talk about a god as a person or something anthropomorphized, and other people or other cultures seem to have different understandings of divinity or whatnot. How can that all be, how can people believe all of those things? Spiral dynamics is a model that will allow you to see that as a successive, increasing set of worldviews. We can see it even in a single individual. A young kid is going to have a harder time understanding some advanced Buddhist concepts, but might understand a personified divinity. So even in the course of a lifetime, people can make progressions among successively larger and more sophisticated worldviews. And again, I put that up there because I think it's a diplomatic tool. It helps us construct and live in and have conversations in a tent big enough to hold everyone.